Morning, everybody. Good to see you. I have something that I want to say by way of introduction. It's kind of an embarrassing story, but I think it will be helpful. I have a whole library of those for sermon analogies. So you may or may not remember, a couple of years ago, I talked about it a lot while preaching at the time. I was part of a cohort of pastors that were from all different parts of the U.S., but they were mostly located in places that were a little more progressive or more opposed to God or in Jesus. So San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York City, Austin, Texas slipped in there, a few other of those types of cities. And the goal of this cohort was to be not hip churches in these areas, but it was how do we remain faithful to orthodoxy for a long time in these areas that are so-called opposed to Jesus or opposed to the message of the gospel. How do we do those? Because we don't want to be syncretists. We don't want to be just like the culture, and we don't want to hide away in our little bunkers either. We want to be like Jesus and be in the world and love and hold up the truth that Jesus may change lives, as he does. And so there was one church that I was really, really excited to go visit as part of the cohort. It's one of the reasons I joined it, and this church is in New York City. And I really looked up to, I still do, but that statement in the past tense will make sense in just a second here. I looked up to this church a lot, and I wanted to do things at Anthem just like them, and I was really motivated by the way they organize their church, the values they have within their church. The lead pastor is a really great preacher, and so there was a little thing in me that was kind of like, it's like going to see your favorite band play a little bit. Now, that's really embarrassing to admit to you guys, but it's true. And so I get to New York, and then I'm walking on the street, which, first of all, if you know me, you know I'm a very fast walker, and I finally feel like at home in New York because everyone's finally walking the pace that they should be walking everywhere. But anyways, take that for what it is. I get there, I get to meet the lead pastor like right away. He's like there at this worship night that they're hosting the night before the conference starts, and so I'm like, this is so cool. I get to be here. I get to see their building, which is just like a rented old building in New York City, so it's not even that great, but it was like a little bit of a pilgrimage for me. But it was one of the most helpful things, not because they dropped gold nuggets of wisdom, not because it was everything that I thought it was in my head. I show up to this worship night, and what do I encounter? I encounter Christians being Christians. I encounter a band that is pretty good, but also there were tons of tech issues that night at the worship night. As the weekend went on, I met people from the church, and some of them were really nice, and some of them were kind of jerks, and some of them were somewhere in between the two of those things. And I remember being encouraged and built up from that time, and I remember flying away on the plane, and I remember feeling this profoundly. It was a little bit of a sad thing, but it was actually a really helpful thing looking back on it, is there's not a lot of like things in the church world that I idolize, and that was like maybe the last thing that like God broke. And kind of like on the plane, the Lord was saying to me, you're not going to find anyone or anything that's going to be exactly the way that you hope that it will be in the church world. In other words, Andrew, stop trying to be like anyone else and be you, and Anthem needs to be Anthem. And we can always grow and be better, but stop trying to take something from over here and plop it into your spot. Now, why do I tell you this story? There is something, I think, that is in all of us, that the grass is always greener on the other side. At another church, things will be better. In another, that family seems to have it together, but we don't. So what are they doing? Now, certainly, there's things that certain churches are better at than others. I'll give you that. I think there's other churches that do things much better than we do, and I think there's a few things we do better than other churches. It's not a competition. I'm just saying. And there's this idolization that can happen in all of our hearts. It's this false image that we get of church people and maybe how we are supposed to be. Maybe that's the best way I can put it. We love to talk about the early church in the book of Acts. And we say, wouldn't it be great if we could just be like the book of Acts? Wouldn't it be great to just go back to Acts and be just like the early church? Well, that was actually a community of broken people, just like you and me, who God was working through in a unique time of history If you want to get another area or idea of what the early church was like, you can read the rest of the New Testament, and we don't tend to idolize that version of the early church. All the epistles are written, all of the problems that are abundant in those communities. We're going to talk today about perception. We're going to talk today about wrestling. We're going to talk today about someone who is actually the subject of this passage that Pam read, who may be a little bit surprising to be the subject. We're in the passion narrative of John, which means Jesus is heading to the cross. And every moment right now is pivotal. Every passage we're going to be looking at is an important part, an important bookmark, an important hallmark of that story. And what we have here is Jesus is now formally, finally being delivered to be crucified. And Jesus is the subject. Obviously, all of this craziness is about Jesus. But the subject of this passage really is Pilate. This is a narrative about Pilate. And the reason I told that story about New York and how embarrassing it is for me to be the way I am sometimes is because I think we have this image of what it looks like to come to Jesus and what it looks like to follow Jesus. As if all the answers are given, and I just have to adhere to all of these answers, and then I will confidently walk with all of these answers all the rest of my life. Two things are true about Pilate, okay? Number one is that he was guilty and complicit in bringing Jesus to be crucified, and we're going to see that. Pilate did play a role in that, and anything I say today is not dismissing him of what was his to own. But the second thing that is also true about him that we need to really pay attention to today is that he wrestled deeply with the person of Jesus in front of him. Actually, my whole life, hearing the Passion narrative, if I'm honest, I've always kind of assumed that Pilate was just this cog and he just had a stern brow and he just pushed Jesus through. And I've been really convicted in this season of really marinating in the book of John to see, yes, he was guilty of the things that he did, and I'm not saying he's a saint or someone we should aspire to be, but what you can always do in the Bible is we can always find ourselves in the humanity of the people around Jesus. And that's what I want to look at today, is this wrestling of Pilate with Jesus and also all the stuff going on around him and all of the mess of his heart. That's something I think we can all relate to. Jesus is before us, whether we're a follower of Jesus or we're just examining him. And who he is, what he presents, what he says to us is often in conflict with the things we hold most dear, the trust structures we have built within our hearts, the things that our hearts long for and desire, and we wrestle. So today's a bit of a hard word, but I don't want it to be like a condemnation. It is not at all. It's not a judgment, it's not a rebuke, it's not any of those things. I want to push a little bit against us today that we may not fear the wrestling. We need to reclaim, one of the great tensions of our faith is there are truths that we hold and that we treasure and that we build our life upon. And yet if you'll read the Psalms, if you look at the people that followed Jesus, if you even look at Paul himself, there is room in our faith for wrestling. And what I think happens, if I may be so bold as to make an assumption, is I think that we fear those feelings, fear those confusions that we have, and so people will go, myself included, years, decades without confronting the things that make them unsure or unsteady. And then what happens when they don't get addressed is that hard times happen, hardships happen, and then we have a faith that we think is true for the good times, but when the hard times come, we can't reconcile those two things. I've said this a million times before, but back in the day, long ago, what they used to do is they would take the sinew of the hip of an animal and they would bind the scriptures with that sinew. And it was a reminder of the wrestling of Jacob with God. And it's a reminder that this Bible and this God that we worship is strong enough to handle the wrestling. And I think a little bit of wrestling would actually be a good thing for God's people. We are asking questions today that I think people think are novel about God and the authority of Scripture and the nature of God, and they're actually just as old as time itself. They just look a little bit different in today's day and age. So I want to talk about wrestling today, namely, so that we're not afraid of it. You don't have to be afraid of it, okay? If it's done within the context of a loving and perfect community, there's room for it. And so, okay, enough intro. Let's get into it. So, let's look at the first 6 verses that Pam read. This is the narrative here. Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. So he was talking to Jesus and then talking to the Pharisees, talking to Jesus, talking to the Pharisees, and he kind of like is proceeding now with this trial. He's proceeding with this humiliation of Jesus. So he took him aside, and Jesus is now being whipped and he's being beaten. The soldiers then, who love an opportunity to do stuff like this, have now taken a crown of thorns. They've twisted thorns together into a crown. They put it on his head, and they arrayed him in a purple robe. Purple is a sign of royalty, so this is a mockery, what they're doing of Jesus. And then they came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," dripping with sarcasm here, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." There's some tension here that we should be feeling. No guilt, and yet here's Jesus being humiliated and put on display. Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Now, if this is kind of weird to you, that's actually normal, I think. What's in this text is a very strange tension that I want to bring to the surface and I want us to look at together. You have Pilate, who up until this point has been talking to the Pharisees and talking to Jesus. And if you remember from last week, Pilate doesn't really want anything to do with Jesus. He doesn't think that this is a clear trial. Jesus has done things to upset the Jews, but not really anything to upset him. He's trying to find out what he's done that would justify this capital punishment, because it's his name that's going to go on the order. And so Pilate here is like in this logistical situation, and he doesn't quite know what to do with Jesus. And because his fear is rising and his uncertainty is rising, we see in here this tension here, where this stuff is proceeding. Jesus is being beaten, he's being tortured, he's being humiliated by the soldiers who are like frothing at the mouth to proceed with this. He has the Pharisees and the religious elites outside who wanted this done yesterday. They're so eager to have Jesus out of the picture. And here you have Pilate in the middle, wrestling, unsure. We have him on one hand carrying forth with the flogging and the mocking. The momentum of the moment is building. And yet he's trying to make it abundantly clear at the same time, I don't think he's guilty. Just so you guys know, as this is proceeding, I can't find any guilt in him. So we see here our first tension, which is popular opinion versus personal conviction. Popular opinion and personal conviction. Now, Pilate is not a Christian, okay? Let's get that on the table here. This is a little bit different than if you're a follower of Jesus and you're doing some wrestling. Pilate is not someone who really has thought at all about Jesus. Now, why is that? He's not part of God's covenant people. He's not just, but he is an official in the Roman government as they're occupying Jerusalem, the place where God's people live. And here he is finding himself for the first time ever confronted with this person who claims to be the Messiah, who claims to be the leader of the Jewish people. Now, he's not convinced about Jesus. He's not 100% sure that he's denying the Son of God or anything like that. But what is before him is this man who is innocent, who is, last week we saw he's a king of sorts, who's building a kingdom of sorts, and has followers, and he is building this momentum. And I just am imagining there's something in Pilate that's like, wait a second, what's going on here? Who is this man? Who is this man? There's the popular opinion about Jesus. He's an insurrectionist. He's a criminal. He should be brought to death. The Pharisees are making their appeal very clear to him that he is 100% deserving of this, believe me. And yet Pilate's like, I'm not so sure. I haven't seen anything objective. In 1 Corinthians, this won't be up on the screen, there's this really helpful thing that you and I need to embody about what we believe as followers of Jesus. It says, the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. We need to present what Jesus has done as it is, present Jesus as who he is to everybody, to be fair, to be honest. But brothers and sisters, we also have to stop trying to make Jesus cool. Jesus never says, make me cool. He says, follow me and tell people about me. And what will happen is what maybe you guys have experienced or expect from people around you. Not all the time. We'll get to that in a second. But sometimes it's what you believe is completely silly, and there's no reason to base your life around it. Now, that's the wrestling that's sort of happening here. Everyone's looking at Jesus as like, what is this? Who is this? Get him out of the way so we can go back to life as it was. And yet Pilate here is wrestling with that. He's wrestling with these new convictions he's having. He's not a follower of Jesus. He hasn't trusted Jesus for anything, but he's not sure what's going on here. It's very easy. I'm not trying to minimize how easy it is to give in to the mob, to give in to popular opinion. Where Pilate is where you and I find ourselves a lot of the time. We believe something. If you're a follower of Jesus, and if you're not and you're here, we're glad you're here, but if you look at Christians, people in this church, we believe something that's incredible, okay? We believe something that is kind of crazy. Those of us who have been in the church for a while and following Jesus for a while are kind of comfortable with this craziness because we trust it, we believe it, we've leaned on it, we've seen it proven time and time again. But if you just zoom out and look at it, it is something that is wild. We believe that we worship a man who died and rose from the dead, and we believe is seated at the right hand of God. We believe that. But to those who don't want anything to do with God or Jesus, that's a wild thing to believe. So here's all I'm trying to say with this. I'm not trying to get people like uneasy. All I'm saying is this. Two things are true. That there is room for questions in our faith and the things that we believe. There's room for that. Look at the Psalms. Look at the New Testament. Look at all these places where people wrestled with who Jesus is and what his reign means for your life. And the second thing that is equally true is that you and I are to grow in our convictions. Now, those two feel at odds with one another. How do we grow in conviction of something that we have a ton of questions about? And that's exactly why I don't want us to be a people that shy away from the wrestling. I don't know everything there is to know about the Bible. I don't know everything there is to know about Jesus or the God that we worship. But I will tell you this with full certainty, that the seasons that I've had of wrestling, they have been times where perhaps I've wandered. They've been times where perhaps I was not as on fire as I should have, or I was even cold to God completely. But what I found through those wrestlings as I continued to show up to God, to show up to the people of God, to show up to His Word and His Spirit, that those seasons of wrestling actually turned into further growth, further understanding, further comfort in the person of God. There's room, brothers and sisters, for questions. There's room for wrestling with the person of Jesus in the church. But then we are to also grow in our convictions as we wrestle. Paul is unapologetic about this in the New Testament. Peter, maybe even more so, that growth is expected for Christians. We are called to grow, to look more and more like Jesus. But my hypothesis is, because it's been true in my life, is we avoid that growth because sometimes it requires confronting some things we're afraid to confront. Popular opinion versus personal conviction. The world's voice is very loud. And what the voice says is, Jesus was a nice guy who has some vague teaching that might be helpful for our lives. Now, I'm not slamming the world's perspective of Jesus, okay? Those things are true about Jesus. But if that's all he is to us, then what we believe loses all of its power. Popular opinion and personal conviction are often a source of wrestling for us. Let's move on in the narrative and look at another one. Verses 7 through 11. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. Let's pause there. You can leave that up, Logan. So the Pharisees are like, you may not see any guilt in him, but what you don't know is that we have our own code over here, and Jesus has been going around parading and saying, I am actually the Son of God. Now, to those who had ears to hear and to see him and who knew him, that drew them to him, because they were all hoping for this Messiah to come, this leader of God's people who would usher God's people into a beautiful reign. They saw him, they trusted him, they heard him, they saw what he did, and they came to him. This is the disciples, this is all the people that followed him. But there were many, many, many people who dismissed him, who walked away as he was teaching, who wanted nothing to do with him. And there was a group of people, including the Pharisees, who say, that's actually blasphemy to say that, and you're angering us by saying that. And so they're bringing forth their convictions. Now, Pilate doesn't know about this stuff, okay? He's not someone of the Jewish faith. He's not one of God's covenant people. So he's not well versed in their law, which is why he keeps giving Jesus back to them, saying, you deal with this. You deal with this. I don't know what's wrong with him. You deal with this. But something about what they said, saying he's claiming to be the Son of God, is pouring some fuel on the fire that is his growing convictions or concerns about who Jesus is. And the reason I know this is because in verse 8, it goes on and says, when Pilate heard them say this, he was even more afraid. I'm not letting Pilate off the hook. He's responsible for what he's responsible for. But I just think it's interesting that this man who was used to being a figure of power and authority and who very often moved in a very decisive way is being struck to the core and is afraid about moving forward with this. It's very humanizing. It's very relatable. Verse 9, so he entered his headquarters again. He goes back inside. He's got a track meet here. He's going in and out. And he said to Jesus, where are you from? He's trying to get Jesus to give him something here. But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Meaning, your life's in my hands, dude. I could make this a lot better for you if you would just let yourself off the hook by telling me who you are. And Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Jesus is saying the authority you have is from God, and the guys who gave me to you are the ones who are really orchestrating this. Now, there's another wrestling here. Pilate is confronted with what people are saying about Jesus and Jesus himself, and he's afraid that maybe Jesus is who he says he is, or maybe Jesus is innocent. And that's directly at odds now, as this is escalating and growing, with his fear of disappointing the growing mob that is outside. The mob probably started with just the people that arrested Jesus and brought him to him. It's probably now grown to this like fever pitch and frenzy of people. So here's the second wrestling that I think we could all relate to. The first one was popular opinion versus personal conviction. The second one is fear of man versus fear of God. Fear of man and fear of God. Now, I'm not saying that Pilate fully feared God, right? But what I am saying is he's presented with the holiness of Jesus. He's presented with who Jesus is, and it's causing him some pause. But at the same time, everyone wants him to proceed forward as if nothing wrong is happening. Is that relatable at all to anybody? We are caught in these moments, whether we follow Jesus or not, where Jesus is saying something, Jesus is casting a vision for our life, Jesus is convicting us of the wrong that we've done, but bringing us back to the Father in love. And yet to adhere to that, or to stop what we're doing, to go to him, or to fully devote ourselves in this direction would mean all the people in this direction would think we were crazy or weird or too different or in a cult or whatever you want to say. We have fear of God pulling us in a good and holy way, and yet we have fear of our concerns about how others will perceive us. Now again, I say this with zero condemnation. I say this as one who is diagnosing my heart, and I believe ours as well. This is a real part of following Jesus. But just like 1 Corinthians before spoke to the former wrestling, the book of Luke speaks to this wrestling. Jesus is talking about the Pharisees in Luke 12. It's not up on the screen. And he says to his followers who are growing more and more afraid of the Pharisees, he says, "Have no fear of those who kill the body. And after that, they have nothing more they can do." Okay, that's a crazy thing to say. Jesus is like, "Oh, don't worry about them. They can just kill you." What? What in the world? He says this in verse 5, "But I will warn you who to fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." Jesus is presenting two realities. He's saying, hey, the Pharisees could just deal with the here and now. God knows the state of your heart. God is the one who judges the heart. And if that sounds really harsh, it's meant to alert us, but then Jesus follows it up immediately by saying this, which should be a huge comfort to us. He says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows." So we talk about the fear of the Lord quite a bit, and it's really a reverence for God, but it's more than that. But it's that at the base. It's seeing ourselves in the right light, and it's seeing God in his right light. And it's easy for us, brothers and sisters, to be very close-minded, to be very stuck in the here and now. And if we're not careful, again, no condemnation, just an observation, that we can give into the wrong fear. We can give into our fear of man. We can give into the fear of opinion. We can give into the fear of those around us. When we've been offered a beautiful invitation to fear God and to follow him, the one who's numbered all the hairs on our heads and longs to commune with us. Our reverence must be greater than our reputation. So here's something that's true. You and I worship a God that is awesome. He is huge. He is magnificent. He is bigger and more powerful and stronger and wiser than we could ever know. And so it is, number one, it is normal for us to wrestle with him as we learn and as we grasp this truth. As we learn more about God, it's going to push against some things that we hold sacred and dear. Our mind's going to be bent in, like, can that be true? How do these two things work together? That's all part of growing towards the Father. And the other thing that is true at the same time is we are to grow in our reverence of God. And like I said before, these two things may sound like they're at odds with one another. Questioning, wrestling, asking questions, digging deeper, versus a deeper trust and a deeper reverence. And I would actually say that the more we avoid the wrestling, the less reverent we get towards God.
Yeah, that's right.
I think we need to do more wrestling, because in the wrestling you will find more of him.
That's right.
And you will learn more about his character. And you will learn more about his goodness, which maybe is just theoretical for some of us. Because we're afraid to go there. We're afraid to question that. We're afraid to poke at that. We're afraid to examine it and hold it up to the Word and with others. The world's voice is very loud. And what the world's voice is saying is that God is not trustworthy, if he's even real, and he is someone to be only feared. How could a loving God do X, Y, and Z? And so we hear that, and if we're not careful, we say, you know what? They're right. God isn't good. And then we distance ourselves from him slowly over time. When if you wrestle, if you press in, if you see who he is and his full character as revealed throughout the whole Word of God, as you commune with God through prayer and through the Word, you will meet the true God instead of just hearing about him from people that don't like him. Let's finish up the narrative and the last wrestling. John 19:12 through 16 say this. From then on, so he has this conversation with Jesus, and from then on, Pilate sought to release him. So Pilate is not giving up. He is trying to get Jesus off the books. He's trying to get Jesus out of the way. He's trying to have his hands clean of what's going on with Jesus. But the Jews, the religious elites, cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Now, for the first time, things are starting to get a little bit personal for Pilate. He has said some things to the Pharisees that he didn't mean to, but he ended up offending them earlier. That was a few weeks ago. And here they are now. They're saying something to him that is questioning his integrity and questioning the very nature of his occupation. Pilate is, by default, by occupation, an extension of the authority of Caesar in this region. He has pledged allegiance to Caesar. He has pledged allegiance to the government. He has pledged allegiance to carry out the king's orders. This is not just what he does, but in a very real sense, it is who he is. It's who he is. And so much of his life is wrapped up in this calling, in this job that he is in. And so here come the Pharisees, and they are doing everything. Pilate's doing everything to get Jesus back into their hands. They're doing everything they can to convince him that Jesus needs to be crucified. And what do they say? They say, if you release this man, you are a traitor. You are not worth your salt as a governor. You are bad at your job. You are not who you claim you are. See, this is not just, they can't really do anything to him, but they can convince him, which is what they're doing. They are attacking his identity and his assurance in who he is as a person. And Pilate doesn't say anything in response to this, but his actions kind of betray where his heart is at. In verse 13 it says, Pilate heard these words, and he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Aramaic, Gabbatha. So what he does, he hears this, and he stops going in and out trying to get more evidence. He goes and sits in the seat of judgment to remind others around him that who he is and the authority he has. I think a little bit to remind himself as well. There's all this wrestling, but once his identity is pressed, what the truest thing that he thinks is true about himself, which is, I'm a loyal servant of Caesar, and this is my job, this is who I am. As soon as that's pressed against, the wrestling kind of stops. And then he goes right back to the place that's going to solidify the identity that he has given himself. We do that, right? Just me? Okay, anyways. Yeah. Here's the last wrestling. He's maintaining his identity. He's trying to maintain integrity. It's the wrestling of the old life versus the new life. Now, I want to be fair. I want to talk about identity language, okay? In the church, we I think, rightly so for our context, I'll say it that way, rightly so for the context of church, we say this all the time. We say, you are not what you've done. You are not what other people have said about you. You are not even how you've defined yourself. You are, in Christ, the beloved son or daughter of God. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. That is true of everybody. And you have dignity, worth, and value. And then what we can do in the church, and we don't mean to, is then we look at everyone else, even in the church, and say, how could you believe anything different about that? Or it's so weak to assume that you are your job, or that your job, is who you are. Or it's so fragile, we'll say, to make your own identity. And I kind of want us we can hold to the truth of what you and I know to be true about the reality of what Jesus has done for us, and that is the truest thing about you and me. But can't we just say with fairness that for people who don't have that it is very natural and understandable that in a crazy world, people would want to cling to something that gives them some sort of source of true north, some source of left or right, some sort of meaning for them to decipher their life. And the reason that I think that that is true and something we should at least acknowledge is that Christians do that all the time. We all do that. We all forget what is truest about us, which is that we are beloved children of God in Jesus Christ. We say, okay, and then we go and try to form up and shore up our identity and all the other things that we do. Again, I'm not condemning anybody. I did that a million times this week. But I do want to diagnose it, and I do want us to wrestle with it. And I do want us to know and remember when we're speaking to people that don't see Jesus as Lord, that this is just what humans do. It's what Pilate's doing here. It's what the Pharisees are doing. Everyone needs a place to live from, an identity that is formed that helps them make sense of the reality around them. That is a sacred core for humanity. But we know in Jesus, we are confident that we have passed from an old life and have gone into a new life. Our wrestlings are confronted with verses like this in Romans 6, which is not up on the screen. Paul says, we were buried with Christ in our baptism with his death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we might walk in newness of life. That's what baptism is symbolizing, right? When we go down into the water, we are symbolizing that all of who we are is going into death with Jesus like he did on the cross. And when we come back out of the water, we are brought into newness of life. That's what's promised in the gospel. That's what we are conveying to the world. That's what baptism means as a sacrament. There's a lot of other things about baptism too, but not for today. So that is what we hold dear as followers of Jesus. And yet one chapter over in Romans 7, Paul has one of his greatest written wrestlings, where it's the famous part that many of us know, and if you don't, strap in. Paul's like, I know what I'm supposed to do. I have the things that I want to do, and yet the sin in me, my flesh, is warring against those desires, and I find myself doing all these things that I don't want to do. I know they're wrong, and yet here I am stuck in this middle spot. And he just says, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to Jesus. There's a tension there that we all wrestle with. So I want to say this to close. You and I believe, if you're a follower of Jesus, that a miracle has happened inside each of us. Now, that may sound like flowery language or something, but if you believe the Bible, if you believe what Jesus has done and said, you actually believe that a miracle has taken place in your life. Now, it doesn't feel like that at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning at work, but that is actually what we are saying when we say that we have been made, we are new creations in Jesus Christ. You're literally believing that all of us, we are spiritually dead before Jesus, all of us, and yet he through the grace of God, reached down and saved us out of that death and brought us into newness of life, and that now you and I are alive spiritually. That's crazy. That's a lot, all right? The spirit may be willing, but the flesh is often weak. So here's two things. There's room for questions, okay? But at the same time, you and I are called to live into this reality. The New Testament is filled with the wrestling of this, but also, a lot of the letters are the writer explaining the truths of God, and then the back half is like, here's how that looks fleshed out in your lives. So we learn and we grow and we ask questions and we poke and we prod and we try to grasp these crazy things that we believe that are true. But at the same time, Paul and Peter and everyone else who writes in the New Testament is like, all right, so now you got to live like that's true. And here's the thing that I'll say. That may sound like those two things are at odds with one another, but they are not. Because the saints in here will tell you that have been around a while that the more we live into the will of God, the more we live in faith and trust and take steps towards Him and obey even when we're not sure if it's true, you will begin to see that the promises in the first chunk of those letters start coming true. You start to see that God is true and not a liar. You start to see that God is sure and unshaken. You and I start to see that as we trust Him, as we take steps in that direction, that God is trustworthy and that what He has said about your life is true. As bad as you and I want to define things on our own. And so as we conclude, or as we wrap up this narrative, let's continue reading. Verse 14, now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? One last check. Chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. I'll just close with this. Pilate wrestled greatly. I hope that's been clear in this text. He may not have been able to fully see Jesus for who he was, but Jesus was at least presenting questions in his life. He was at least pushing against some of the things that he assumed to be true. And in the end, Pilate took Jesus and said, I don't know what to do with Jesus. I'm tired of fighting this, and I'm going to just let things proceed as they do. Now, I don't want to, like I said from the beginning, we got to be honest about Pilate, right? He is guilty in playing a part in putting Jesus to death. He kind of gave up in his wrestling. The reason I want to talk about wrestling, the reason I want to bring up hard things in our faith, which I think this text presents for us, is I want us to be a church. I want you to be a person. I want myself to grow as a person that is okay with the wrestling. Listen, God can handle it. God can handle it. Okay? Now, here's some things to avoid, okay? Some things to avoid are, what are some things to avoid? Doing this all by yourself that is a surefire way to get yourself into holes and thoughts that are really, really unhelpful. If you're going to wrestle, you got to bring some helpers. You can't do it alone. That actually is a bad thing to do. You got to do it with people. Because when you're wrestling and you find yourself asking yourself some scary questions about God, do you want to be alone when you do that? No, you need some spotters. You need some. If you're at the gym, you're trying to lift some heavy weight, right? Like I do all the. I canceled my Y membership a few months ago. It'll come back someday. If you're trying to lift heavy weights, you should not try that by yourself. You need what are called spotters, which is a strong person or two people to help you do it, not just to get the weight back up, but to do it in a way where you don't hurt yourself in the process. You need spiritual spotters as you wrestle with God, because you're going to hurt yourself spiritually. You're going to tear a spiritual muscle. You're going to strain something. And I can't, as your pastor, stress that enough. And I think what's led to a lot of the confusion about, here's the other thing to avoid, is to try to get confirmation from people that you don't know and trust outside of the church. Because we have people bringing their wrestlings, not to a community of followers of Jesus, preferably of mixed age. You want some wisdom speaking into this wrestling. You want some experience. You want different life stages. But when people don't have that, or probably when they don't value that, then we take our wrestlings to the internet or to other people. And I'm not saying that the internet doesn't have wise things for us to grow our life upon. It's that it's all in a vacuum without relationship. And what you're doing is you're taking all these things and you're composing this manifesto of what you now believe about God, cutting and pasting with no accountability. Your faith is supposed to be walked out with other people. You do technically have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that your salvation is yours. He saved you. He loves you. What did we read earlier? The hairs on your head are numbered. Brothers and sisters, that's about where the individualism stops in the church. It's about it. It's about it. And you and I need to have the humility to recognize that and understand it. I think even within a church as well-meaning as ours, not perfect, but well-meaning, where we value community, we hold community up, we say, yes, this is something that's important, be in community. If we're not a community that's a place where people can wrestle with these things, then we're not really doing what we're supposed to do. But we have to also have enough courage and let me say faith to bring those wrestlings to the people of God that we may work things out together there. Because I think in a highly individualistic culture that we're in right now, that makes its way into church, and unless your input is reciprocated in the way that you and I think it should be, then we say this isn't for me, or they don't get me, or whatever. And then we go and find another church only to find that that's another group of sinners as well. So here's my plea. I'll get off my soapbox, but I do want to say, you need to be a person, I need to be a person, if we follow Jesus, that is comfortable with pushing on some of these things. And the way you do that is you do that with people that you know and you trust and you love. You do it with the Bible open. You do it prayerfully, asking for the Spirit to guide that process. And what you will find, if you stick with it and don't get bored, if you stick with it and don't give up, if you stick with it in the context that this is supposed to be done in, which is in the community of God, I think what you'll find is not what you think. The lie is, as we wrestle, that we will automatically now think that God isn't real and that none of this matters. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised if you invite people into that, if you invite the Word into that, if you invite the Spirit of God into that wrestling. If we try to do it on our own, I will just say that you may find yourself in some dark places. Pilate wrestled on his own. He did it by himself. He did it without any other guiding factors. And again, I'm not condemning him. I'm just saying it's a great thing for us to look at this and to learn. You and I have each other. We have all the people here, the ones you like and the ones you don't like. We're all here. And this is where this needs to happen. We are a church that, well, I really am done now. I said that like 4 times. I just feel like the Lord wants me to say this. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. It's the verse we all know from that great hymn. We will stand on this book. We love this book. It's true. It's timeless. It's the very word of God given to us. We will never be a church that apologizes for that or shirks back from it. But you're not honest if in engaging with this book you haven't wrestled with it at some point. And this needs to be a place where we hold up the word, hold up the truth of God as a high priority, but where we also feel the freedom to wrestle with one another. Not that we may learn facts, but that it may work its way into our heart and into our soul, that we may live different and experience God in our lives. That is the tool to which it is designed and given to us, that we may follow it, love God, and then live as his image bearers looking like Jesus. Those all can be true at the same time. All right, let me pray. Band can come on up. Let's close now. Father, would you help us as we respond now? Would you help us to be given to you and to your Son and to your Spirit? Lord, would you help us? Would you help us to rest on things that are eternal, that are true, that have always been? And I pray that for everyone in this room, whom there are places of doubt, seasons of doubt, seasons of concern, that you would help us as we wrestle together as your people to find the truth contained therein. Lord, what I don't want for us, what you don't want for us, is to be Christians who live siloed lives full of fear and uncertainty. You've called us to more than that. And we're all guilty of that. I say that with zero condemnation. But I pray that we would bring our concerns out of the shadows and to the people that we know and love. I pray that this would be a place where followers of Jesus who've wrestled with things for a long time can bring things and be lovingly confronted with the truth by others. I also pray that we would be a place for people who are far from God and have questions, that they can come and be confronted with the truth in the way that Jesus did it, which for those who are far from God was full of love and grace and understanding. But Lord, the more proud we become, the more self-assured we become instead of assured in you, Lord, that leads us to pockets and areas of pride where if anything is pressed against our heart, we react in a negative way. That's how the Pharisees were. It's how Pilate was. So Lord, would you keep our hearts confident and tender, confident in you and not ourselves, and tender towards the instruction and rebuke of those around us, that we may be formed to look more like Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.